when the two-month Battle of Peleliu officially began on September 15, 1944, in the early hours of the morning, a formidable U.S. On a tiny coral island in the Palau chain, Navy warships practiced their weapons. The battleships Pennsylvania, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Idaho were among them, and they were backed by numerous heavy and light cruisers. A guy had to shout at the top of his lungs to be heard over the deafening boom as the cannons started fire upon H-Hour's arrival, their muzzles spitting enormous sheets of smoke and flame. The 1st Marine Division's Marines were already on their landing craft, anticipating this initial barrage to further weaken the Japanese defenders of the island. The majority of the men were veterans who had eaten portions of steak and eggs for breakfast earlier. Nevertheless, even the most battle-hardened Leatherneck must have been sickened by the acrid stench of spent cordite from the naval bombardment and the sour scent of diesel oil. Tom Leah, a war writer, recalled seeing one painted warrior staring over a gunwale with grim determination, his big hands in the last moments before the tough tendons drew up to kill. Some of the troops had daubed their faces for jungle cover. Although they were in a range of vessels, these initial waves were mostly in LVTS, landing vehicle, tracked. Another name for them was Amtrak, or amphibious tractors. They were referred to as alligators by some Marines. A constant rain of shells was pelting Peleliu just ahead. Every ear-shattering explosion sent flames skyward, and thick coils of smoke rose to create a throbbing black curtain that shrouded the landing beaches in a gloomy veil. The advancing Marines could only hope that the sheer might of the barrage would destroy the Japanese defenses. After all, the Japanese had not fired back with their own weapons, and this was the 3rd day in a row that bombardment had occurred. But such optimism turned out to be far too optimistic. The approaching landing craft was soon the target of fierce Japanese artillery fire, with towering water geysers marking the close calls. It was the first indication that Peleliu might not be as easy as some commanders had thought. Some later referred to the Battle of Peleliu as the Pacific Theater's hardest campaign, and it was definitely a tough nut to crack. Nimitz against MacArthur. Peleliu is a tiny island with a lobster claw-like shape that is roughly 6 miles long and 2 miles wide. It is a component of the Palau chain, which makes up the Caroline Archipelago's westernmost tail. Although Peleliu was actually one of Palau's smaller islands, it appeared to have great strategic significance at the start of 1944 because of its airfield. The Japanese were obviously on the defensive by 1944. The island-hopping tactic, albeit expensive, was working, and the United States had taken the lead. Across the wide expanses of the Central Pacific, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's forces were engaged in combat. American soldiers captured Tarawane and the Gilbert Islands in 1943, followed a few months later by Kwajalein and Eniwetok in the Marshalls. By the summer of 1944, Tinian, Saipan, and Guam were safe, and the Marianas were the next target. The liberation of Guam, which had been an American territory prior to the war, was especially satisfying. The invasion and capture of the Japanese home islands was the ultimate objective. However, how would the Americans accomplish their goal? There were countless opportunities in the wide Pacific. The contrasting viewpoints and opposing personalities of America's top commanders fueled the growing controversy. While General Douglas MacArthur was steadily moving forward in the South Pacific, Nimitz was island-hopping to the north. Since August 1942, when America started its first significant offensive at Guadalcanal, it had been a long and difficult slog. Since then, MacArthur had controlled the most of New Guinea after advancing through the Solomons. Although MacArthur's desire to free the Philippines was well known, some of his Navy colleagues disagreed. In July 1944, President Franklin D. Roosevelt met with MacArthur and Nimitz in Hawaii to break the deadlock. The commander-in-chief heard each man's plan and vision. In order to advance to Okinawa and eventually Japan, MacArthur intended to liberate the Philippines. Nimitz desired a more straightforward, rapier-like push that would completely avoid the Philippines. Instead, Nimitz recommended that the main targets be Formosa, Taiwan, and Okinawa. They would make excellent staging grounds for the invasion of the home islands of Japan. The Admiral also believed that the Chinese mainland should be invaded by American forces. A sizable portion of the Japanese army was based in China, and under Chiang Kai-shek, the Americans' Chinese allies occasionally faced hardship. Roosevelt agreed to MacArthur's suggestions after giving them some thought. A significant stopover on the route to Japan would be the Philippines. However, MacArthur's intentions for the Philippines abruptly brought the Palau chain, and Peleliu in particular, into the spotlight. Japanese airfields in the Palaus, which were roughly 600 miles east of the Philippines, may pose a threat to MacArthur's right flank. The decision was made to neutralize the threat and capture Peleliu. Irony in retrospect, the Battle of Peleliu and Operation Stalemate II. Ironically, the Battle of Peleliu was codenamed Stalemate II because at first the battle was perceived as a rather hopeful operation. The 1st Marine Division, a mostly veteran unit that had fought at Guadalcanal and New Britain, was assigned the primary responsibility for securing the island. The 11th Marines, artillery support, and the 1st, 5th, and 7th Marine Regiments, infantry, formed the 1st Marine Division. The United States would handle the campaign's secondary goals, the 81st Infantry Division of the Army. Just south of Peleliu, on the Palau chain, was Angkor Island, which the 81st was to capture. The Palau endeavor was to be the first taste of combat for what were essentially green men, and the division had been recreated in 1942. However, their main objective was not limited to Angkor. Additionally, if necessary, they were to supply a reserve for the 1st Marine Division. Everything hinged on the Marines. The 81st would be prepared to assist the Marine mission if it stalled or encountered unforeseen opposition. However, the 81st would be free to pursue its own mission at Angkor if the Marines had the situation under control. The commander of the 1st Marine Division, Major General William Rupertus, was convinced that his Marines could take the island within a few days and was hopeful about the next campaign. He was an old-school leatherneck who was deeply rooted in Corps customs and extremely protective of other military branches. To be honest, he didn't want to be a part of the 81st in case the Army took away some of the Marines' honor. An overly hopeful strategy. The Marines were assured that the enemy would be easily defeated. The 1st Marine Division would, after all, be a larger, strengthened division. The general optimism at headquarters, however, did not allay the worries of a few commanders. A successful amphibious invasion should outnumber the adversary 3-1, according to the general rule that was developed from extensive and brutal experience. On paper, the division would have roughly 28,000 members, but at Peleliu, the enemy was estimated to have about 10,000. Although it sounded as though the 3-1 ratio was being upheld, these comforting numbers weren't quite right. Artillery and other experts were included in the numbers, said Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, commander of the 1st Marine Regiment and an increasingly legendary figure in the Corps. Only 9,000 riflemen made up the division, and the foot-slogging, long-suffering rifle companies would ultimately determine whether the division won or lost. Puller's top officers either disregarded or minimized his protests. Puller's worries were rejected by General Rupertus, who maintained his upbeat assurance. After the first landings, Rupertus believed the island would be safe in about 5 days. Puller and his 1st Marines would bear the costs of the general's unwavering optimism as events transpired. Fukaku, strategies in the zone of absolute defense. The Japanese, meantime, were not at all idle. Indeed, a significant change in Japanese strategy was to be tested at Peleliu. The Japanese military was filled with a fervor that frequently turned into fanaticism in the early months of the Pacific War. The ideal was Bushido, or the way of the warrior, which embodied the ancient samurai spirit. Japanese soldiers viewed the American red-haired barbarians with disdain due to fervent nationalism fueled by strident propaganda. It was common for Japanese troops to claim every square inch of land during the early years of the war. Machine guns, rifles, artillery, and mortars would destroy human-wave banzai charges led by Japanese commanders brandishing samurai swords. Even the most traditional Japanese quickly saw that the long-held beliefs needed to be altered. The sophisticated weaponry of the enemy were too strong for the samurai spirit to defeat. To discuss future operations, Lieutenant General Sadai Inoue met with Japanese Premier Hideki Tojo in Tokyo in March 1944. Tojo, a well-known hardliner against the United States and war minister, was pragmatic enough to recognize that reforms were necessary. It was obvious that Japan lacked the means to defeat America in a meaningful way. A negotiated peace was the best that could be expected. Tojo promoted the later-named Fukaka tactics. For every place the Americans took, they would have to pay a heavy price in life and treasure in this attrition-based war. The Japanese would build pillboxes and bunkers between rock outcroppings and coral ridges, taking advantage of the natural characteristics. Additionally, they would expand naturally occurring caves to accommodate hundreds of soldiers. The absolute defense zone, which served as a last-ditch defensive barrier for the Japanese home islands, included Peleliu. Tojo hoped that a protracted struggle would be too much for the United States to handle. The Americans would be eager to negotiate if they were white. They might even agree to Japan's ruthless annexation of Southeast Asia and China, enhancing the natural defenses of Peleliu. After being named commander of the Palau district group, General Inoue quickly took a plane to his new location. In reality, the Palau chain is made up of over 100 islands dispersed over 100 miles of the Pacific Ocean in a broad arc that extends from southwest to northeast. About 25 miles from Peleliu on Koror was the Japanese administrative hub for Palau. Although Inoue's headquarters were in Koror, he was persuaded by survey flights of Palau that the primary enemy targets would be Peleliu and nearby Anguar. Despite their tiny size and relative isolation, the islands were significant because of their airfields. An seasoned officer, Inoue was aware that he needed a decent soldier on Peleliu. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, who was renowned for his bravery and skill as a tactician, was his choice. At Peleliu, Nakagawa would essentially have complete operational control with minimal intervention from higher-ranking officers. From a Japanese perspective, it was a great choice because Nakagawa was primarily in charge of Peleliu's fierce defense. Colonel Nakagawa was supposed to have about 10,000 defenders under his command. However, accounts differ slightly. Nakagawa most likely relied on his own 2nd Infantry Regiment, reinforced, the men he knew the best. The non-commissioned officers, who are always the backbone of any army, were tough and experienced, and the 2nd Regiment had fought in China. Additionally, numerous Korean construction workers and Navy troops were present. Japanese strategy benefited tremendously from the island's topography. While the suggested marine landing beaches to the southwest were shaded by coconut trees, the southern end of the island was rather level and covered with brush. There, Nakagawa stationed a single battalion of men, although they were disposable and simply intended to delay and kill the enemy. The Umurbrogol Mountains, a mountainous chain of jagged hills, draws, and ravines that made up the backbone of the island, would be the main target of Nakagawa's actual defense. The Umurbrogols ruled Peleliu and offered a great vantage point from which to watch enemy activities, but the title Mountains is misleading because the highest peaks only rose to a height of about 300 to 500 feet. By creating passageways in the jagged rock and coral that could hold anywhere from 12 to 1,000 troops, the Japanese further increased the size of Umurbrogol's network of natural caverns. Sliding steel doors covered some of the caves, but apertures in several of them concealed shooting embrasures. In addition to strengthening the defense, these caverns shielded the area from the American naval barrage, which Nakagawa was aware invariably came before an amphibious assault, making it through the artillery barrages. Little did the Americans know what lay ahead of them. In retrospect, aerial reconnaissance photographs, which are typically trustworthy, turned out to be misleading. From above, Umurbrogol seemed like a gently rolling range of verdant, tropically lush hills. However, the craggy peaks, sinkholes, and sharp coral ridges of Umurbrogol were subdued by the rainforest flora. The complete labyrinthine horror was only exposed after naval bombardment removed this jungle mask. The attack on Peleliu started when Navy warships bombarded the small island with artillery for 3 days. Alongside the shelling, 500-pound bombs were dropped by planes from nearby vessels. During this first softening up of the target, The Navy is reported to have fired 1,845 rounds of 14-inch shells and 519 rounds of 16-inch shells. However, all of the noise and commotion ultimately meant nothing. The Japanese only needed to hunker down and wait out the bombardment because the Peleliu caves made great bomb shelters. The bombardment appeared successful to American observers, wearing field glasses as they scanned the beaches and saw enormous pulsating smoke pillars rise high into the sky. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf actually quickly announced that he had run out of profitable targets. The illusion was further supported by the exceptional fire discipline of the Japanese. The fact that none of Nakagawa's guns responded to the barrage created the appearance that the majority, if not all, of the defensive artillery had been destroyed. Initial interaction with the enemy. The northern, left flank beaches were designated as White Beach 1 and 2, which planners codenamed for Chesty Puller's 1st Marines. They were to press inland while simultaneously protecting the 5th Marines' flank once they were ashore. The 1st Marines would eventually turn and attack into the Umurbrogol, which planners simply referred to as high ground, in a northerly direction. The 5th Marines, on the other hand, would land on Orange Beaches 1 and 2, in the middle. One of the primary reasons the Americans were attempting to seize the island in the first place was to secure the airfield, which would be their first task. Colonel Harold Bucky Harris commanded the 5th Marines. Despite being fresh to the unit, he had a lot of pre-war experience as a professional officer. The 7th Marines would anchor the left, southern portion of the attack on what was codenamed Beach Orange 3, under the direction of Colonel Herman Hard-Headed Hannikin. They would sever the island, cutting off and finally securing the southernmost parts of Peleliu. On September 15, 1944, the Marines landed at 8:32 a.m., only 2 minutes late. 75mm howitzers mounted on armored amphibian tractors, LVTAs, preceded the initial wave. Their primary objective was to attack and eventually destroy artillery sites or other strongholds that the air and naval bombardment had failed to reach. Wire-controlled mines that lurked about the island like a deadly necklace were smashed through by the LVTAS and the LTVS that followed. These were airborne bombs modified for the purpose, not actual mines. Fortunately, several control wires had been severed by the naval bombardment, making them inoperable. Even those that remained intact did not explode, primarily due to smoke blinding their operators. It was the Marines' final stroke of good fortune for a long day. A lethal volley of 47mm fire, augmented by 20mm machine gun bullet sprays, struck the LVTAs and LVAs as soon as they were within range. Nakagawa had constructed concrete emplacements on the left and right flanks, which were the main sources of the fire. Many shells sadly found their mark, as the landing craft had to navigate a gauntlet of enfilade fire. Within the first 10 minutes, 26 LVAs were directly hit, and within the first hour and 40 minutes, at least 60 were destroyed or damaged. Burning debris covered the beaches and shallow reef seas, and several Marines went ashore for water and ammunition, leaving their injured alligators behind. Almost immediately, the 1st Marines encountered difficulties. Colonel Puller almost died after a Japanese 47mm shell struck his LVT directly. His leadership capabilities were hampered when his whole communication section was destroyed by another Japanese shell. It was going to get worse. Undermining the point. Although there was intense fighting along the landing beaches, the flank units, the 7th Marines on the right and the 1st Marines on the left, were most severely hit. I saw a wounded man near me. His face was half-bloody pulp, remembered combat artist Tom Leah. Private First Class E.B. Sledge of the 5th Marines said coldly, "Shells crashed all around," as he collapsed behind me in a blood puddle on the white sand. A few yards behind us, pieces smashed the sand and splashed into the ocean as they ripped and swirled. When Puller's 1st Marines came upon a 30-foot-high coral ridge, they had barely gone 100 yards from shore from their inland start. Numerous Japanese defensive tunnels and emplacements were interspersed throughout the ridge, which the Marines promptly dubbed the point. To allow for the snout of a machine gun or other weapon to protrude, Japanese engineers had made holes in the coral and then sealed them again. The point was not on any map, and it seemed that the United States had not even targeted it. Thus, the 1st Marines were in shock. Navy weapons. The point was raking the landing beaches with fire in addition to delaying the approach. The decision had to be made, but frontal attacks were becoming expensive. Moving around the flank and taking it from behind was the only option to complete the task. Captain George P. Hunt of K Company, an experienced commander who had been on Guadalcanal, was given this difficult assignment by Colonel Puller. K Company immediately left, but things were not going well. Numerous pillboxes made of reinforced concrete appeared on all sides, resembling evil mushrooms. The members of Company K used a straightforward yet efficient formula, since they knew what they were doing. Smoke and small arms fire surrounded pillbox embrasures, allowing Marines to approach and hurl rifle grenades or explosive satchels into the openings. When its main fortification, a sizable blockhouse made of reinforced concrete that held a 25mm gun, was eventually captured, the point was conquered. When a rifle grenade was thrown into the blockhouse by Corporal Anderson, it bounced off the muzzle of a 25mm gun and fell deep into the casement, igniting the ammo that was kept inside. The blockhouse was completely destroyed by a succession of dramatic explosions, with smoke and flames rising into the oppressive tropical air. A few of the defenders attempted to flee the Holocaust while their uniforms were burning. The Marine bullets killed them. Maintaining hard-won ground. Hunt had captured the point, but darkness was falling and he was alone. Company K held its hard-won prize against enraged Japanese counterattacks for the following 30 hours. The Japanese attacks were repulsed, but at a high price. Company K was a shattered remnant of what it had been when Hunt and his men were relieved. With just 18 soldiers left at the point, the captain was holding on to property that had been valued at the expense of lives. In total, just 78 of the 235 soldiers who made up Company K survived. The Japanese disputed every inch of rock and coral, but the 5th Marines were making considerable headway in the center. One of the campaign's main goals, the airfield, was reached by the 5th Marines by the afternoon of the first day. Nakagawa launched a massive counterattack with tanks and infantry because he was not going to surrender the airfield easily. Under the leadership of about 15 Type 95 Ha-Go light tanks, this was a serious and well-organized operation rather than a crazy banzai charge. With the exception of a few soldiers holding on to the outside of the tanks unfortunately outpaced the infantry. The Americans were prepared for and anticipated exactly such an onslaught. Marine artillery quickly made its imprint, and M4A2 Sherman tanks' firepower helped to support the effort. Soon, all of the Japanese armor was destroyed, and the infantry that was assisting them were either killed or forced to retreat. Preserve momentum. Although the Americans were on Peleliu to stay, anyone who opened his eyes could see that the island's capture would not be as easy as everyone had anticipated. Despite the slow pace and increasing casualties, General Rupertus remained almost pathologically optimistic. The 1st Marines had lost 1,236 men by D-Day +3, but Rupertus was still telling Puller to maintain momentum, as though this well-worn phrase would win the war on its own. The Umurbrogol meat grinder was arguably the worst, despite the fact that there was fierce combat throughout the island. Temperatures in the shade rose to 105 degrees Fahrenheit on the second day, and then to 115 degrees, a humid, steamy climate that drained the moisture from every pore and wilted even the hardest leatherneck was the only respite from the intermittent rains. Heat prostration became as lethal as gunfire from the enemy. Rupertus insisted that Peleliu would fall within a few days and that everything was under control. However, the number of casualties was increasing to the point that practically everybody who was physically capable of carrying a rifle was being sent to the front lines. They sent engineers, pioneers, and even headquarters staff to fight. Additionally, African American Marines volunteered for combat service. They were support troops from the 16th Field Depot who carried up ammunition and supplies. During that period, African Americans were sent to segregated units, specifically the 7th Marine Ammunition Company and the 11th Marine Depot Company, Although there was a lot of racial discrimination in the military at the time, their services were accepted due of the need. Under intense fire, the Black Marines also assisted in the evacuation of seriously injured troops. Due to General Rupertus's misguided confidence, the Army's 81st Division was authorized to launch its attack of Angkor on September 17th. At least by the standards of the Pacific War, the Angkor mission was successful and was achieved with comparatively little deaths. The 81st stood prepared to help the Marines secure Peleliu, its task effectively completed in a matter of days. Rupertus persisted in rejecting all help. All I wanted to do was kill. The 5th and 7th Marines completed their assigned responsibilities by September 23rd. The southern portion of the island was under American control, and the airstrip was secured. After that date, Marine fighter planes started to land on the island, supporting their stranded ground forces from the air. However, after suffering some of the bloodiest and most violent combat of the whole Pacific War, the 1st Marines continued to suffer significant losses. Every inch of coral in Umurbrogol's craggy draws, narrow ravines, and steep valleys was purchased with blood. A few hours of restless sleep at night hardly made up for days of brutal, non-stop fighting. In this living nightmare, the sheer horror that engulfed certain leathernecks muted their emotions. Before long, nothing remained, not even the most basic human decency, after love, honor, and friendship were rendered meaningless. I resigned from the human race, recalled a veteran of the 1st Marine Regiment. We had lost our humanity. I shot at anything in front of me, whether it was an enemy or a friend. I didn't have any pals. All I wanted to do was kill. Keeping Hill 100, Captain Everett Pope of Company B, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, was instructed to capture Hill 100, a knob of high ground that commanded a path known as the East Road, at midday on September 19th, while Puller's 1st Marines were still fighting their way into the Umurbrogol, also known as Bloody Nose Ridge. This was normal for the 1st Regiment, which was being bled white, but Company B had landed with 242 men and was now reduced to 90 effectives. Pope and his troops reached the peak of Hill 100 after hours of grueling and violent combat, only to discover that the maps that were previously in use were inaccurate. Hill 100 was a section of a ridge that connected to a higher knob 50 yards away, rather than a single knob. The Japanese quickly started firing down on Company B after seizing that upper knob. Additionally, Company B was exposed to a lethal crossfire when the Japanese opened up from a parallel ridge to the west. Pope was aware that he was in danger because the enemy was all around him, and he had no way to get assistance. He may have tried to break away, but ultimately decided to stay. The cost of acquiring this terrain was high, and Company B's exposed position may actually deter Japanese attacks on the battalion below. The Marine captain later recalled that the defensive perimeter Pope and his troops established was roughly the size of a football field. Although Company B received considerable mortar support, they were besieged and could only use the ammo they had brought with them. About 20 Marines remained to defend Hill 100. The battle over the hill entered a new phase as the sun set. Throughout the night, the Japanese launched a series of counterattacks. It was a moment when the staccato buzz of gunfire blended with the sounds of men yelling for assistance or sobbing in agony, creating a horrible cacophony that reverberated through the night. Combat turned into a hand-to-hand battle. Some Japanese soldiers once attacked Sergeant James McAlarnis and Lieutenant Francis Burke in close quarters. Burke's leg was stabbed by a Japanese with a bayonet, but the lieutenant smashed his attacker with his fists. McAlarnis hit a second assailant with a rifle butt, while Burke was distracted. The Japanese bodies were subsequently hurled down the slopes by the two Marines. When dawn finally arrived, it was likely the most exquisite morning the survivors had ever witnessed. As the battle came to a close, Company B's ammo was so low that the men began throwing pebbles at the enemy, not expecting to strike anyone hard enough to cause harm. Later, the captain clarified that the Japanese would temporarily halt an attack because they believed the rocks to be explosives. As their supply of genuine grenades dwindled, the Marines periodically threw one to throw the enemy off balance. Finally, even bravery had to yield to overwhelming numbers. Although Pope was ordered to leave Hill 100, the the Japanese were preparing for another attack. Only 9 soldiers, including Pope, managed to return to American lines in the end. The injured Everett Pope was awarded the Medal of Honor for his valor. Not until October 3rd, nearly 2 weeks later, was Hill 100 retaken. Unyielding inter-service competition. General Rupertus persisted in dismissing the Army's 81st Division's offer of assistance. Rupertus would rely on the same shop-worn hope that Peleliu would be taken by the Marines in a few days. However, Rupertus's commander wasn't so certain. The 3rd Amphibious Corps commander, Major General Roy Geiger, landed and personally examined the positions of the 1st Marine Regiment. It horrified General Geiger. The 1st Regiment was broken up and pulverized by the Battle of Peleliu. Meat grinder, making it obvious that it was simply a regiment in name. The relentless stress of attempting to accomplish practically impossible goals with limited manpower has worn even Chesty Puller down. Geiger had had enough. Rupertus was informed by the Corps commander that the 81st Division would be providing support to the Marines. According to some reports, Rupertus's refusal to accept the truth that his division was being annihilated was the reason for the tense conversation. Rupertus's obstinate belief that Peleliu was solely a Marine operation contributed to inter-service animosity as well. He seemed to be reluctant to share the glory with the Army. On September 23rd, the 321st Regimental Combat Team of the 81st Division touched down on the western beaches of Peleliu. The 1st Marine Regiment left the campaign completely. Both the men's relaxation and recovery, as well as the reconstruction of the broken regiment, would require some time. The 1st Regiment suffered around 1,672 casualties from the Japanese in fewer than 200 hours, but estimates vary. Just 74 men from 9 rifle companies survived the battle, representing a 71% casualty rate for the 1st Battalion of the 1st Regiment. The Army takes center stage. The Japanese were reduced to their final stronghold, the Umurbrogol Mountains, by the end of September. Once more, it required scuttling through deep caverns and strongly fortified ridges. General Geiger made the decision to remove the wiped-out 5th and 7th Marine Regiments, that is, what was left of the original 1st Marine Division, because the fighting was so intense. The 3rd week of October saw their withdrawal. The fighting did not become any less intense, but it was now an Army show. The Japanese defense perimeter gradually reduced to a pocket roughly 400 by 900 yards when the Umurbrogals were besieged. Peleliu's airstrip, known as Marine Air Base Peleliu, or MAB, was completely functional by the end of September. The advancing Americans received close air assistance from Vought F-4 U Corsair fighter bombers and Grumman F-6F-3N Hellcats. Because the island was so tiny, it took the Corsairs less than 15 seconds to reach their destination after takeoff, not even enough time to retract their landing gear. Only 1,000 yards from MAB, there was once a bombing run on a Japanese strongpoint, near enough for bomb pieces to saturate the airfield. Despite the fact that it was obvious the Japanese were losing, the struggle continued into November. With little success, Japanese forces in the northern Palaus had attempted to bolster Nakagawa's waning garrison. The American gauntlet of ships and aircraft was attempted to be navigated by a convoy of about 15 Japanese barges carrying men. Most of them were taken to the bottom after being found. Despite lacking the majority of their equipment, about 600 ragged Japanese managed to make it to shore. An untimely giving up. For the past few weeks, it was practically a siege. In addition to heavy artillery and airstrikes, American forces made effective use of napalm and flamethrowers. Finally, cave openings were destroyed by armored bulldozers, burying Japanese forces far underground. By the end of November 1944, organized Japanese resistance had disappeared, and Peleliu was fully secured. Colonel Nakagawa ordered his regimental flag burnt and then killed himself. Almost all of the 11,000-man Japanese garrison was destroyed. Only 19 of the 202 captives captured during the campaign were Japanese, according to the record. The remaining workers were Okinawan or Korean. Despite being one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War, The Peleliu campaign had an odd afterstory. Lieutenant Tadamichi Yamaguchi surrendered his samurai sword and led 26 survivors out of hiding on April 27, 1947. The final official surrender of World War II, which had concluded 20 months earlier in 1945, was made by Yamaguchi and his men. World War II. History magazine gives you the inside scoop on both well-known and obscure Pacific battles.